The word courage comes from the word cœur, which is French for heart. Courage is when we choose to do something despite the risk of an adverse consequence. It's not about the absence of fear. It's about choosing to act even though that fear is there. Without fear, there is no courage. And we take that action because we believe that there is something more important at stake. Social courage is when we decide to take action despite the fear of an adverse social consequence, which could be anything from humiliation, rejection, judgment, or exclusion. These things can be associated with things like standing up against the status quo, wanting to do something controversial, or being associated with something that's not socially acceptable. These things can really paralyze us and take control of our lives and hold us back from being who we really are, because it's incredibly, incredibly difficult to not care about what other people think of you. It's your best friend who came out of the closet after years of telling everyone that they weren't gay. It's your colleague who walked out of their corporate job to move to India and become a yoga teacher. It's your teenage sister who sat down with your parents to tell them that she had an abortion. The craziest thing about social courage is that your adversary is not one single individual. Your adversary is the fabric of the society that you live in. Because there's a social rule book that exists in every society called the status quo, and we tend to live by it. Whether we realize it or not, we refer to this social rule book every time we interact with someone. Social courage can be summed up by the words of Maggie Kuhn, an American social activist who said, "Speak your mind, even if your voice shakes." In 2016, my mum, Maria, was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer, and I became her full-time carer at the age of 23 years old. By the time they found the cancer, it was already too late. It had spread all through her skeleton via the bone marrow, and the oncologist told us there was so much cancer inside of my mum's bones that there was no more room left inside the bone marrow for the cancer cells to multiply. She was vomiting a lot, her hair was falling out, and she was losing weight so fast that I felt like she was disappearing. A secondary tumour had started growing in her back and got so big that it fractured her spine in 2 places. My mum spent a lot of her free time screaming and crying. She had a fantastic, fantastic palliative care team who did everything that they could to keep her comfortable. But the drugs that they gave her either didn't work properly or gave her side effects that were so horrific that it made it pointless to take them at all. After 3 weeks of blasting my mum with maximum dose chemotherapy, the oncologist sat us down and he said, "I'm so sorry, Maria. We've looked at your latest blood test results. And these results tell us that the chemotherapy we're giving you is actually killing you faster instead of extending your life. Therefore, we have to stop treatment, and you have in the order of weeks left to live." I don't know what I was expecting my mum to say in response to that, but it sure as hell was not this. My mum looked her oncologist calmly in the eye, and she said, "Can you help me to go quicker?" She was asking him for medical assistance, for medication, so that she could pass away peacefully and gently in her sleep. As a nurse with 39 years of experience, she knew that it was possible that in her final moments, she could be left with the kind of pain that no drug would be able to relieve. The thing that she was asking for is now called voluntary assisted dying in Australia, but it was illegal in every state and territory when she asked for it in 2016. So let's just consider this for a second. My mum was a nurse, right? And she's a devout, lifelong Roman Catholic. And she's being treated in a Catholic hospital, asking an employee of that Catholic hospital, who is a doctor, to break the law. And if you go through your little social rule book and look up the bit where it says Catholic nurses and what they're supposed to do, that ain't in the list. So yeah, huge shock. And my mum knew that. She knew that full well. And on top of that, in countries where there is no voluntary assisted dying law, patients like my mum are often misunderstood and labelled as suicidal, depressed, and sometimes even accused of taking the easy way out. And so by asking for what she asked for, my mum knew that she was putting herself up for judgment, humiliation, rejection, exclusion. But she asked anyway, because she believed that there was something more important at stake. Her right to choose how she would spend her final days on earth, and her right to choose not to suffer. In response to her question, the oncologist looked straight back at her and said, "I'm so sorry, Maria, but I'm unable to assist you with your request because what you're asking for is illegal. But please rest assured that we will give you as much morphine as you need." 3 days later, my mum asked a second time to a different doctor, her own palliative care consultant, and he also said no on legal grounds. And 3 weeks after that, I watched my mum die in a way that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I went in and her eyes were pointing in different directions. They had changed colour from brown to grey. She was sweating, but when I touched her face, she was cold. And she stank. She was twitching from head to toe and making this rasping sound. It sounded like someone was choking her. The nurses then started this process called terminal sedation, which was supposed to make her comfortable by putting her into a coma so that she couldn't feel anything. But unfortunately, my mum fell into that very, very small cohort of patients for whom terminal sedation doesn't actually work. The next 4 hours was this marathon of watching my mum twitch and rasp for air in never-ending waves. It was like watching my mum being tortured in slow motion. And she died with her eyes wide open on the 10th of April, 2016. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, this is a very, very depressing talk. Even if you could argue that my mum showed social courage, it didn't count anyway, because she still died this horrific death. And this brings me to my next point. Social courage always counts, because it's contagious. For social courage to survive, all you need is one person to see it. And in my mum's case, that one person was me. After watching my mum die like that, I knew that I had to do something to make her voice heard. I knew that I could not let her courage die with her. And so in April 2018, I presented what happened to her to the Parliamentary Inquiry into End-of-Life Choices, a group of WA politicians who were given the task of investigating how are people dying in Western Australia and does it need to change. All parliamentary records are public. And so I knew that by going forward, everyone would probably find out about what happened to my mum, the way that she died, and what she'd asked for. And I was scared. I was scared that people would accuse me of being a bad daughter for wanting to let my mum die. I was scared of losing lifelong friends who are devout Christians and Catholics. I was scared of my family members never forgiving me for revealing this extremely intimate and personal aspect of our lives. But I did it anyway. I walked into that room of politicians and I told them exactly what happened and exactly what my mum had asked for, because my mum had shown me that sometimes there are things more important than what people think of you. And after I did that, I was done. I did not want to think about my mum dying anymore. I'd had enough. And so I packed my bags and sold my car and set off backpacking around the world for 12 months with my partner. It was just too painful to stay in Perth. I just wanted to leave Australia and never come back. This is where I was by January, the beginning of this year, on an organic mango farm in Colombia, which is on the other side of the world. And I went with my partner and we got engaged. This is me and my partner, not me and the donkey, by the way. He's great, he's really great. So we got engaged, we started planning our wedding, and we were going to move to France because my partner's from France. We were going to move there, and yeah, it was all going to go to plan. It was going to be great. And then I got a phone call. I got a phone call, and the person on the phone said, "Hi, Belinda. We've heard about you. And we were wondering if you'd like to come back to Australia and help us to campaign for the legalisation of voluntary assisted dying in Western Australia." And after I got that phone call, I cried for a week because I knew that if I walked away from this opportunity to share my mum's courage with the world, that I would never forgive myself. And so after many tears and so many Colombian chocolate bars, I put my wedding on hold indefinitely. I scrapped the idea of moving to France, and I decided to come back to Australia and walk from Melbourne to Perth in honour of my mum's bravery and to raise awareness for the need for voluntary assisted dying in Western Australia. I walked holding a white rose because roses were my mum's favourite flower. I chose to walk specifically from Melbourne to Perth because the year after Mum died in 2017, voluntary assisted dying became legal in the state of Victoria, of which Melbourne is the capital. And when I remember seeing this on the news and thinking to myself, I wanted to give my mum that law so badly that I would have put it in my pocket and walked it back across the country for her if I could have. The walk took me 70 days. I walked from 6 a.m. every morning up to 8 hours a day at a speed of 5 kilometres per hour through rain, wind, and even snow. I hit every media outlet I could, every radio station, TV news channel, online media, print media, and more. I jumped in front of every politician who would give me the time of day, and I didn't sugarcoat it for them. I told them exactly what happened to my mum and what she asked for. And I set out to connect with as many Australians as I could who had been through what I'd been through, and I shared my mum's courage with them. And as more and more people started finding out about my mum and about her story, the most amazing things started to happen. I started getting Instagram messages from people who had read about my mum on their news app on their iPhone, and it had given them the confidence to start up a conversation with their colleagues at work around the water cooler about voluntary assisted dying. I started getting messages on Facebook from people I hadn't seen since primary school saying that they had seen me on TV and it had led them to have a conversation with their own parents about what was going to happen at the end of their lives. A woman in the northern suburbs of Perth who owns a cafe, she put out my petition to legalise voluntary assisted dying in Western Australia on the front counter of her cafe. And customers were coming in and she was getting heaps of signatures and everyone was really happy about it. And then a couple of customers complained, saying that this cafe was no place for a petition like that. And she smiled and listened to their feedback, thanked them for their input, and left the petition exactly where it was, right in the middle of the counter. I started getting emails from people in the UK, New Zealand, Singapore, China, South Korea, places where voluntary assisted dying isn't legal. And they started saying that they'd read about me online and it had motivated them to campaign even harder for voluntary assisted dying law reform in their own countries. Australian celebrities started tweeting about my walk, publicly saying that they supported me in everything that I stood for, from Mia Freedman to Hamish Blake, Jane Caro, Mick Fanning, and Adam Gilchrist. By the time I got to Adelaide, I was doing 10 media interviews a week. By the time I got to Bunbury, I was doing 6 interviews a day. Everyone wanted to talk about my mum and about voluntary assisted dying. And little by little, they were starting to realise that the social rule book that they'd always lived by maybe had gotten it wrong. By the time I got to Kings Park on the 6th of August, hundreds of people were there waiting for me. And together, we walked the final kilometre of my walk across Australia to Parliament House. I've often reflected back on my walk and about how the story of my mum just spread through the country like wildfire and just how contagious her social courage was. And I think I finally have an explanation for it. When we see someone stand up to the status quo, it makes us want to stand with them because social courage is already in all of us. Deep down, many of us already feel that it's wrong to allow a dying person to suffer when it's not what they want, when there is no hope of recovery, and we have the medical means to help them. And for those people who heard my mum's story Her story was just the trigger that they needed to speak up. When we see social courage in front of us, it's like nothing else. It's like someone knocking on the door of your conscience that you've never had to open and saying, it's okay. It's safe for you to come out now because you are not alone. 3 weeks after my walk ended, Kyron O'Donnell, a Liberal politician in Kalgoorlie who I met on my walk across Australia, he stood up in Parliament and told the lower house that he was going to support the voluntary assisted dying bill, and he had heard my mum's story and it had changed his mind. On the 24th of September, the lower house of our Parliament passed the voluntary assisted dying bill 45 votes to 11. It's now in the upper house. It's not over yet. It's now in the upper house where it would face tough scrutiny, and the vote will go all the way down to the wire. There is no guarantee that it will pass the upper house. And so, was it all worth it? Is this bill going to pass for good? The truth is, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question. But I do know this. My mum's courage still counted for something, because even if change didn't come in time for her, it just might come in time for someone else. So if you want to leave a mark upon this world, be brave. Listen to your heart. Stand up for what you believe in, no matter what other people think. And if you do believe in something, but you don't know where to start by telling one person. Thank you.